The first thing people heard was not her voice, but the sound of boots scraping her across the dirt, slow and merciless, like the town itself had decided she didn't deserve to walk anymore. By the time her cry finally broke through the morning air, most of them were already watching from behind half-open doors, frozen in that familiar silence that had become Deadwood's true law. Her name was Eliza Hale, a widow who hadn't spoken much since they buried her husband under a crooked wooden cross just weeks before, but today her voice was raw, pleading, desperate as two men dragged her by the arms into the center of the street like she was something less than human. Dust clung to her dress, her hair fell loose across her face, and every time she tried to pull herself free, they tightened their grip just enough to remind her she couldn't. "Please," she whispered. But the word didn't travel far, swallowed by the same crowd that watched her husband die without lifting a finger. The men hauling her stopped near the old water trough, shoving her down so hard her knees struck the ground with a sound that made a few people flinch, but not enough to step forward. One of them, a broad-shouldered brute named Calder, leaned down close to her ear, his voice low but sharp enough to carry. "Your husband owed more than he could pay," he said, "and now that debt belongs to you." A ripple passed through the crowd, not surprise, but recognition. This was how things worked here. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. Eliza tried to speak again, to explain, to beg for more time, but her voice cracked under the weight of eyes that refused to meet hers. And somewhere at the edge of that silent circle, a man stepped off the wooden porch of the saloon, his boots touching the ground so softly no one noticed at first. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply stood there for a moment, watching, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a worn hat, his presence so still it felt like the air itself had paused to see what he would do. The men in the street hadn't seen him yet, too busy making a spectacle of a woman who had no one left to defend her. Calder grabbed Eliza by the collar, lifting her just enough so the crowd could see her face. "This is what happens when debts aren't paid," he called out, his voice loud, almost proud. "This town remembers." A few heads nodded, not in agreement, but in surrender. And then, finally, the stranger moved. Not toward them at first, but forward, just enough that the sunlight caught the edge of his face. It wasn't anger that showed there. It was something quieter, something colder. He raised one hand slowly, not to draw a weapon, not to threaten, but to reach the brim of his hat. And with a motion so simple it almost felt wrong, he took it off. The gesture was small, almost respectful, but it carried something heavy beneath it, like a warning no one had heard in a long time. The crowd shifted. Calder paused just for a second, as if something in that silence had unsettled him. Eliza, still on her knees, looked up through strands of hair and dust, her eyes catching the man's face for the first time. She didn't know him, but for the first time since they dragged her out here, she stopped begging. The silence that followed didn't belong to the crowd anymore. It belonged to him. The stranger held his hat at his side, his gaze steady on the men in front of him, and when he finally took a step forward, it wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried a weight that made the dirt beneath his boots feel heavier somehow. Calder straightened, his jaw tightening as he looked over his shoulder, finally noticing the man who had interrupted his moment. "You got something to say?" he asked, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice, though it didn't quite mask the uncertainty now flickering behind his eyes. The stranger didn't answer right away. He kept walking until he stood just a few feet away, close enough that the tension between them felt like a drawn wire ready to snap. Then, quietly, almost too quietly for anyone at the edges to hear, he spoke. "Let her go." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They landed with a certainty that made the air tighten again, sharper this time. Calder let out a short laugh, glancing at the other man beside him, as if to reassure himself this was still his stage. "You must be new here," he said. "We don't take orders from strangers." But the stranger didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there, hat still in hand, like he had all the time in the world. And that, more than anything, began to unravel something in Calder's confidence. The second man tightened his grip on Eliza's arm, pulling her slightly behind him, as if she were still a shield, still a message to the crowd. "Walk away," he added, more forcefully this time. "This ain't your business." A breeze moved through the street, lifting dust and loose fabric, carrying with it a tension that spread from one doorway to the next. The stranger's eyes flicked briefly to Eliza. Just a moment, just enough to see the fear still clinging to her. But when he looked back at Calder, something had changed. "It is now," he said. And in that instant, everything shifted. Calder's hand moved toward his gun, not fast, not yet, but enough to make the crowd pull back, enough to remind everyone how this usually ended. Only this time, the stranger didn't reach for anything. He didn't even raise his voice. He just took one more step forward, closing the distance until Calder had no space left to pretend this was still under his control. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Eliza felt it, the grip on her arm loosen, just slightly, just enough to matter. Calder hesitated, and that hesitation was all it took. The stranger didn't need to draw his weapon, didn't need to prove anything the crowd could see. Whatever they read in his eyes, whatever history walked with him into that street, it was enough. Calder released her with a sharp shove, stepping back as if reclaiming ground that no longer belonged to him. "This ain't over," he muttered, though the words felt thinner now, less certain. The stranger didn't respond. He simply stood there until the men turned and walked away, their boots kicking up dust that no longer felt like a threat. Only when they were gone did he lower his gaze, placing his hat back on his head with the same calm motion he had used before. Eliza remained on her knees for a moment, the world around her still struggling to catch up to what had just happened. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her legs unsteady, but no longer held down. She looked at him, searching for something, an explanation, a name, a reason, but he offered none. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely more than a breath. The stranger paused, then glanced back at the crowd, at the doors beginning to close again, at the town returning to its silence. "Someone had to," he said, and with that, he turned, walking away the same way he had come. Quiet, unclaimed, leaving behind a street that would remember, if only for a moment, what it felt like when someone finally chose to stand.